So that would then give us that P prime is equal to negative 1 over Q squared. And therefore, marginal revenue would be equal to it would be equal to P plus QI times P prime, which is 1 over Q squared, and that becomes Q over Q squared minus QI over Q squared, which is equal to Q of negative I over Q squared, right? Because P is equal to 1 over Q, so P is also equal to Q over Q squared. Okay. So each firm is going to set their marginal revenue equal to 1. 1 is their marginal cost. And so that gives them that this is equal to 1, which is the same as QI over Q squared is equal to 1 over Q squared minus 1. Okay, so now if we add this up over all of the firms, if we add this up over all of these firms, does anyone want to say what we're going to get? Yeah, Evan.
So what you're going to do is you're going to put a sigma on everything. So it's going to be sigma, and I'm going to say number of firms is n. So that's sigma for up to n of qi over q squared equals sigma of 1 over q minus 1.
Yeah.
So just multiply everything by n on the right side.
Yeah.
And on the left side, sigma qi of n is just q. So that's going to be 1 over q because they cancel.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're going to get 1 over q is equal to n over q minus n, which gives you that 1 is equal to n minus n times q, or n times q is equal to n minus 1, which is the same as q is equal to n over n minus 1. Okay, so what that tells us is that as n grows large, quantity is going to go to its efficient level, which is quantity is equal to 1. Why is that at the efficient level? Because when price is equal to marginal cost, which is equal to 1, quantity is equal to 1. And we'll talk more about that on Thursday. And also notice that the per firm output is going to go to 0, right? Because QI is equal to capital Q over n, which is equal to n minus 1 over n squared, which goes to 0, right? Okay, now when there are just two firms, there's an easy way to represent this graphically. And Ming, how would we do that?
Sorry, what?
If we wanted to represent this equilibrium graphically, how would we do that if there were just two firms?
Wouldn't you just add the two things horizontally?
Add what two things horizontally?
If
we wanted to represent, like, in particular, like what is what, like if we want to find an equilibrium, we need it to be the case that every firm does the optimal thing given what the other firm is doing.
And then
so how would we represent that graphically?
So we had the demand function as fixed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then, and since we're assuming that all the cost functions of all the firms are the same, right? So they're symmetric, right?
Yeah.
So wouldn't it just be a shift of the cost function?
Yeah. So I don't want to rely on symmetry as much right now. I just want to try, as if this was a general thing, to represent like what does one firm do optimally when the okay. Do you remember the idea of reaction functions from the reading? The best response function?
I slept for 4 hours. I can't remember.
Okay. Okay, so that's fine. So basically what we just do is we say, what is my optimal thing given what both of the firms are doing, right? So that's that I have QI over QI plus QJ squared is equal to 1 over QI plus QJ, which you can solve out, and you get that QI is equal to negative QJ plus this, or this. That's called the reaction functions of the firms. So that says, what's the optimal thing for me to do given what the other person is doing?
Okay.
And the intersection between these two things for the two firms is the equilibrium, right? So this says what is the optimal value of QI? What is the optimal value of the J firms given what I is doing, and here's the optimal value of I given what J is doing, and the intersection point is the equilibrium, and we can just check graphically for whether this is a stable equilibrium or not. How do we do that? Well, if we were to increase what J was doing, then I would want to do this, right? That would make J want to do this. That would make I want to do this, and we go back to the equilibrium. On the other hand, if we change it down, if J is doing this, then I wants to do this, and J, you see what I mean? And if they crossed in the opposite direction, we would know that the equilibrium was unstable. Now we can only do that with two firms, but that gives us a way to check for stability graphically, the same way we did in the supply and demand model, and to make sure the comparative statics will be reasonable as a result, right, by the correspondence principle. Okay, yeah, so.
What do you mean by they cross in the opposite way?
Okay, so if these, imagine that these were like for some reason reversed, right?
You mean
And that this one was the optimal reaction of I given Qj, and this was the optimal reaction of J given Qi, right? So then what would happen? Well, if I were doing this, then J would want to do this. And then I would want to, you see what I mean? And that would not be stable. Yeah, Rishi.
The slopes of these, are those determined by the cost?
No, they're determined by a whole bunch of stuff having to do with like the marginal revenue and how it changed its curvature and so forth. Because it's like all about, if they change their quantity, how does that change what my marginal revenue curve looks like? Yeah. So it has a lot to do with pass-through, actually. So the slope of this is 1 minus the quantity pass-through. Okay. So, in fact, I think we'll go through that a little bit later. The Stackelberg argued that it wasn't reasonable that both firms would take the other firm's quantities as given. It might be that there's one firm which believes that if it makes a change, the other firm will be forced to react to that. And therefore, and they might be able to do that by committing to an advertisement about the level of quantity that they're going to sell, or building a certain amount of factories or something like that. And as a result, this is going to create a different incentive. And Philip, what incentive is that going to create for the first firm?
The first firm is going to commit to grabbing a large share of the market and to grab as much of the profit as they can.
Yeah, so it seems like that, but is that true in this picture? So imagine that I'm firm I, and I increase my quantity in order to try to grab more share of the market, right? That would mean I go up. What's that going to do? That's going to increase the amount that J is producing. And that doesn't allow me to grab part of the market. So I know that that's the classic story and the one that they told in your book, but it's not true in this particular case, right? So can you think of a more general expression of that idea?
Well, basically, firm I is going to think of what the other firm is going to do,
Yep.
graph out its best response function, and then with that reply in mind, optimize.
Yeah, so that's right. In particular, what they're going to do is try to take whatever action will get the other firm to reduce the quantity that it's producing, right? Because they want the other firm to produce less, because that allows them to get more profit, right? So in this case, actually, they're going to produce not more, but less in order to try to get the other person to produce less. I mean, that's a particularity of the constant elasticity demand. But in that case, they're actually going to do the opposite of what you were saying. Yeah, Evan.
So if the goal is to increase market share, then why are they not?
It's not to increase market share. It's to reduce the quantity of the other firm and to increase your quantity. I mean, that does imply an increase in your market share, but it's not like you're exclusively interested in market share. You also overall want to reduce the quantity
So-
towards monopoly levels.
Okay, so I guess so that's
Yeah.
kind of, my question was,
Yeah.
why are they not just interested in making sure that they're at a point where their quantity is just growing faster than everyone else's?
Because they also want to reduce the aggregate quantity towards the monopoly level,
Oh, okay.
right? Because the aggregate quantity is too high. And that's the reason why they might want to reduce their quantity relative to what they would do in a Carnot equilibrium in order to incentivize the other firm to reduce their quantity if you have these upward sloping reaction functions. Now, Philip was thinking about a case where we have downward sloping reaction functions, in which case he's right, but that's not generally the case. Okay. So, the follower is basically just like a monopolist on the residual demand, and therefore the follower's reaction function is going to just follow from whatever the leader does, whereas the leader is going to take into account the reactions of the follower and wants to try to induce the follower to reduce their quantity, because this leaves more demand available for the leader to serve. Now, Adam, when, just rephrasing the discussion we just had, when is that going to induce the leader to produce more, and when is it going to induce the leader to produce less?
Well, in that case, it would induce the leader to produce less.
Yes. Why?
Does that have to do with the elasticity, or?
Well, you don't even need to go that fundamental. Just what was it about the way that the follower reacted that induced them, that made them want to produce less?
Well, as the leader produced less, the follower produced less.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's called strategic complementarity. So things are called strategic complements if when one person does more of something, the other person wants to do more of it. They're called strategic substitutes when one person does more of something, the other wants to do less of it. And this is driven by the pass-through rate. So their substitutes if the pass-through rate is less than 1, and their complements if the pass-through is greater than 1. And we know that under constant elasticity, the pass-through is always greater than 1. And that's the reason why you got this result there. Whereas under linear demand, which is the case considered in your book, I think, Philip, you get strategic substitutes because the pass-through is less than 1, and that's why you get this effect. Yes, you all?
So why does pass-through conceptually affect complements versus substitutes?
Because, okay, remember that the pass-through is the same as the quantity pass-through, right? So if I pass through a lot of an increase in cost, then when there's more competition, I'll pass that through into a greater increase in quantity, right? Now, when the leader increases his quantity, if the total quantity increases more than 1 for 1, that means that the follower must have increased his quantity. If it increases less than 1 for 1, that means that he must have decreased his quantity, right? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Which
Evan.
one was strategic complement again? Which one was substitute?
Strategic complements is when pass-through is greater than 1. Strategic substitutes is when it's less than 1.
Which one was it relative to the reaction function?
Okay, when the reaction functions slope upward, that's complements, because that means when one person does more, the other person does more. When they slope downward, that's strategic substitutes. Yeah, Stan. It's strategically neutral. So that happens when you have exponential demand or logarithmic demand in the inverse demand function. So our simple example of CES had pass-through greater than 1, and that's the reason that it had strategic complements. Yeah, Bharat?
Control, would that mean that the actions go on firm would affect the actions beyond?
Exactly. And therefore the Carnot equilibrium quantity is the same quantity that you would choose if you were the leader. Okay, so let's solve this all out in our case. So let's try to find the Stackelberg equilibrium. Okay, so the quantity of the second firm, we know from the reaction function, is equal to the quantity of the first firm times the square root of 2 plus 1 over the quantity of the first firm minus 1. That also says the total quantity is equal to this function of the quantity of the first firm, because if we just add back in the quantity of the first firm, that cancels out that negative 1 there. So what is the first firm's profits going to be then, Bharat?
price is equal to 1 over Q,
Yep,
and then you multiply by Q.
yep.
um,
So that gives something pretty simple.
1.
Sorry.
Wait.
So you're going to do 1 over this, and then multiply by the quantity produced by the first firm. So what will you get?
Q1 over that.
But what is this?
Oh, okay. So you get 1 over square root of 1 plus 1
Yeah,
over
exactly. So it looked ugly, but it's not too ugly, actually. So that gives you the... okay, so price is equal to this. Sorry, what's going on? Price equals that.
Are you assuming costs equal to 1 now?
Oh, yeah, sorry, cost is equal to 1. So this is profits. Sorry, what you gave is revenue, Bharat. And then we need to solve this. So that gives this here, and we need to solve that out for the optimal quantity. Florence, could you come up to the board and solve for the optimal quantity for firm 1 there? Let's see, there's an eraser here if you want that.
Okay, so we have, wait, that's profit, right?
Yeah, that 1 over the square root of 1 plus 1 over Q1 minus Q1 is profit. Probably don't call that P because that's price, call it pi. That's what we usually call profit.
Minus Q1. And we need to set, so we maximize this
Yeah.
when this is third derivative is 0. So, I think it's this.
Yeah, that looks good.
So we set this to 0, so we get this. This becomes 2.
One thing you might want to do is try bringing this inside of there,
Yeah.
and then putting everything to the 2/3 power.
Right. That's okay. Sorry, I'm kind of just blacking out.
No, you're doing pretty well. It's not easy. So 2 times what is equal to, okay, here's another way of doing it. Try bring, this has a negative, right? So you
Yeah.
can think of it as being down in the bottom
Right.
to the 3 halves, right?
Yeah.
Multiplied by that. And what, when you multiply 2, gives you 3 halves?
3/4.
Exactly. So you're going to have to put this in there with a 4/3 power, right?
So it'd be this.
Great. And now, yes, there's no negative here actually.
Oh.
But, yep, now you're very close. Great. Okay, so this actually can't be solved analytically from the point that she's gotten it to. But here's where she got. And Mathematica, if you plug this in, very nicely done, Florence, gives us Q1 is equal to 0.1, which is way, way, way below 0.5, which we got before. Right? So this strategic incentive led the firm to dramatically reduce the quantity that it was producing because there was such a strong upward slope to that best response function we saw, right? On the other hand, with linear demand, you'd increase your quantity, right? So the issue of strategic substitutes versus complements, and therefore of pass-through, is really crucial here to how firms want to choose their quantity. Okay, yeah.
In that formula, shouldn't 2 be raised to the power of 2?
Yeah, that's probably true. I don't know how much that affected my Mathematica calculation or not. Someone else can go and verify it if they want to.
Can you post the Mathematica?
I don't think I have it. I might have it. I'm not sure.
Oh, you're solving for Q1.
Yeah, so Florence has got it right, and I've got it not perfectly right, unfortunately. Yeah. So there's a few things to notice. So even with many firms, prices are still above cost, though on Thursday we'll show that they gradually fall towards cost. The prices are going to be between the prices under monopoly and perfect competition. And one of the most interesting results comes from asymmetry. So imagine that firms had different costs. Then the lowest cost firm is going to have to be producing more because the price is constant. They have a larger markup, and the markup that they have is equal to their quantity times the derivative of price, the negative quantity times the derivative of price. So the bigger their quantity is, the bigger their markup is. And therefore, the firm with lower cost will have to be producing more in order to have the same price. But, of course, the higher cost firm is still going to produce some, which is inefficient when we have linear cost, right? So monopoly will always be, they might charge too high of a price, but whatever they're producing, they'll produce efficiently. Competition always produces efficiently. But oligopoly may misallocate production to inefficient firms. Okay. So in this more general asymmetric case, we can still add things up, and we get the total quantity times the slope of price plus n times P of Q is equal to the sum of the costs. So if we then divide by n, we get that the average quantity times the derivative of price plus price is equal to the average cost. And so what that tells us is that the pass-through of any firm's increase in cost is like increasing the average cost in the industry by 1 over n. So it's sort of just the sum, it's the average cost only that matters of the firms. And as we'll see some models that we'll talk about later, where a tiny change in one firm's costs can have a really big impact. Here that's not true at all. All the firm's cost changes have the same 1 over n impact, even if firms are heterogeneous. Okay. So the situations we've been studying so far, yeah, Christian.
So since the costs don't really seem to matter as much, so if we're talking about like the Stackelberg leader thing, like that doesn't depend on like who can produce the cheapest at all. It
No.
kind of depends on like who's first, who's the most.
Yeah, well, it's a strategic assumption, basically, yeah. So what we've been studying so far is usually called a game. This is a strategic situation where a small number of people make a choice. Here either prices or quantities or quality or something like that. But more broadly, it can be anything. It could be who to date, where to eat, etc. And the participants' payoffs depend on all players' actions. My profit depends on your quantity. And the players take their actions simultaneously, as in Cournot. That is called a normal form game. On the other hand, if one player takes an action, then another player takes an action, that's called an extensive form game, and that's what Stackelberg is. So, for example, chess is a extensive form game, while rock paper scissors is a normal form game. And like competitive equilibrium, we need some notion of what it means to be a solution. Under perfect competition, this was when supply equals demand. Here, it's not exactly obvious what's analogous. And the most famous concept is a general version of what we've been studying so far, which was invented by John Nash. The two most famous solution concepts in this area correspond exactly to the two games we've been talking about. So Nash Equilibrium corresponds to how we solve Cournot. It's where every player takes as given the strategy of the other players and chooses an optimal strategy given this. And the equilibrium is therefore the intersection or the generalized intersection when there are more than two players of the reaction curves. The second is the subgame perfect equilibrium, which corresponds to the Stackelberg model, where one player acts first and the other takes their actions as given. In chess, there would be a series of actions, but at each stage, everyone would take everything that's happened in the past as given. Okay. And these are usually solved via backwards induction rather than the intersection of reaction curves. Backwards induction is you look at the last stage of the game and everything everyone could do. You say, what's the optimal thing for them to do at that stage? Then you ask, what's everyone's best thing to do, anticipating all the things that people will do in reaction to that, and you go backwards from there. And the reason that we can't solve chess perfectly, why there aren't perfect ways to play it, is it's just too hard to look at all possible outcomes and trace them backwards. But in fact, backwards induction is precisely what most of the best computer algorithms playing chess do, at least in some part. They look at potential things that could happen, they assign points to those, and then they trace backwards what people are going to do to maximize those points and so forth. Okay. Yeah, Rishi.
Does that mean like you start with whichever move gets checkmated, or whichever player gets checkmated?
Okay, so that is something that you could do. But the problem is that's like, there's just too many things from that point. So what these things usually will do is they'll take like the current state of play and they'll go about like 50 moves deep.
Okay.
Or maybe not 50, that could be too many. But maybe they'll go like 20 moves or 10 moves deep. And they'll look at all possible outcomes that could occur through any set of strategies. They'll assign points to all of those, and then they'll backwards induct up from there. Okay, so if we have this broad concept, the key question is, what are the strategies of players? What do they take as given that other people are doing when they take their action. Now, we assumed that strategies were quantities, right? But there's no reason that they have to be quantities, right? Do we think that companies, when they're choosing how much to produce, take as given the quantity that other companies are producing? Why shouldn't they take as given the prices that other firms are producing? Mike Fosco, can you see what difference that would make if everyone took as given the prices that other firms
Change
were?
the externality to a real one because you have to change the quantity if you take the price that's fixed.
Yeah, exactly. So, and what would that do to how firms behave?
They would change their quantity or they would try to find prices that would, or cut down their price so that they would take all the competition from other firms.
Yeah, it's going to lead the firms to behave more aggressively than before. So in particular, let's imagine there's several firms with the same constant marginal cost, and each of these firms takes its price of its rivals as given. Joan, can you see what the equilibrium has to be among the firms?
They take all the prices as given?
Of the other firms as given, yeah.
I know that it's supposed to be just C.
Why? Can you give an argument for why? Imagine that it were something above C. So first of all, it can't be anything below C, right? Because then people would be taking losses, right? What if it were anything above C? What would one firm want to do?
The other firms would undercut them.
Why?
Because they could without losing, and they would gain all the market share.
Yeah, with just a tiny loss in price, right?
So everyone would own firms.
Exactly. So this leads to what's called the Bertrand and Edgeworth paradox, that with even two firms, price is exactly equal to cost, right? And this seems a little bit implausible, right? Because it requires that if I undercut the other firm even by a tiny amount, I take all of the business away from them, right? Maury, what are some of the reasons you think this might not happen in the real world?
There are costs of comparing the two products.
Yeah, that's a good reason. That's called search, yeah. Can you think of other reasons?
Maybe there's consumer loyalty to a specific company.
Yeah, they might not view the two different products as completely identical with one another, right? Both of these two forces can be captured in a model where my quantity depends on all of the prices, but not necessarily in this particular way that if I just go a little bit below them, I get all the market, but it just in some smooth way, my quantity is a function of all the prices. And each firm is effectively a monopolist, but only on their own product, not on all the products in the market. And the other products are substitutes in the sense that if the prices on the other products rise, then the quantities of this firm will rise. And that's the definition of being substitutes. Okay. Now, this is a very broad model, and you could either choose the prices to be the strategies, as we were just doing, or the quantities to be the strategies. But the most common way people do this is they do what's called Nash and prices, or Bertrand differentiated products. So this model is often called differentiated products, Nash and prices. Yeah.
So when you write
Evan.
the quantity for firm I,
Yep.
why is it not Q minus I, and why is PI inside that function?
Because my quantity, the amount that I sell, depends on my price, but it also depends on the prices of all the other firms.
You're not so you're evaluating it. So you're trying to evaluate it including your price?
Well, because if they raise their price, then I'm going to get more business. If they lower their price, I'll get less business. Right? That was sort of the argument that Maury was giving, right? Yeah.
Could it be that if you lower the price in the long term, you'd accumulate more market share because consumers are able to recognize that your price is lower over time?
Yeah, so that's basically what this captures, right? Is that if my price is lower, I'll get more business.
But in the long term, wouldn't that be more pronounce?
Yeah, well, so we know that in general elasticities tend to be larger in the long term than in the short term, in many cases, though not always. Like an example where they would definitely be higher in the short term than in the long term is like if one company just has a sale this week, everyone might go visit them that week, and another company the week when that other company has a sale. But if they lower their price over the long term, you might not want to get all your stuff from that one company, right? So, okay. So we didn't actually do the hoteling model, I'm realizing. So we're just going to go through that and do that now. Okay, so the simplest model is the hoteling model. This is one, let me see if I have a picture of this. No, I don't. Imagine that there's like a line, right? And two firms are at different positions along this hoteling line. And customers find it costly to travel. So people live at different positions, and the firms are at two different positions. And so the firms are not identical. You like the product that you live closer to, and you dislike the product that you live farther from. So then a consumer living at point X, in particular, imagine that the firms are at the two ends of this line, right? So a consumer living at point X can either pay a T times X to go to the firm that's at 0 and the price of 0, or they can pay T times 1 minus X to go to the firm that's at 1 and pay their price P1. Okay, so Ming, what is going to be the value of X such that the consumer is just indifferent between the two firms? Yeah.
Essentially what I do is just solve for x, right?
Yeah.
Using the inequality.
Using the equality, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're indifferent, then you're...
Then you don't care either way.
Exactly.
Right? Okay, just help me agree with...
Yeah. That'd be great.
I can't even read my handwriting.
You have a double negative, so it needs to be a positive, so it's 2tx.
Yeah, you're right.
You lost a t.
Wait, no. So this yeah. Oops. And then. Is that right?
Nicely done, Ming. Yep. Great. Okay, so thus, so what does this tell us? This says that when the prices are equal to this, everyone to the left of this point is going to be buying from 0, and everyone to the right of this point is going to be buying from 1, right? So if we have uniform distribution of people, the number of people buying from 1 is just x, right? Because everyone to the left of x buys from 1, and so their quantity is P1 minus P0 plus t over 2t. So this gives us just linear demand, right? Between the two firms. And what is going to be the optimal price, Maury, when the cost is equal to 0?
When the cost is equal to 0, so you wanna.
So what would be firm 1, sorry, this is firm 0's optimal quantity. Sorry, not firm 1. And I got 2, and this is all messed up. So this should be Q0 of P0, P1.
Oh, okay.
What's firm 0's optimal optimal price going to be?
So would you try to maximize quantity here?
You're going to maximize profit, right?
Yeah.
And do you remember how you price if you're a monopolist against a linear demand?
No.
Well, I mean, you can also try to solve it out, but there's a trick.
Is the trick half
Yeah.
from the maximum price?
Exactly. So with a little assist from Ming, can you figure out what that means here? So you go half from the maximum price that would kill all demand.
Oh, okay. So you set quantity equal to 0?
No, you go halfway to the price that would kill all demand. Right? So what's the price here that would lead you to have no demand? What would P0 have to be for you to have no demand?
It would be P1 minus T.
P1 plus T, right?
Plus T, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then what's the price you're going to charge?
P1 plus T over 2.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay. So if P0 is equal to P1 plus T over 2, what is P1 going to be equal to, Philip?
By symmetry, it's just going to be P0 plus T over 2.
Exactly. And so what's then going to be the equilibrium value of both prices, Philip?
Well, by symmetry, there's going to be a symmetric equilibrium.
Yeah.
So you get P equals P plus T over 2. Then
Yeah.
it's adding P, subtracting P over 2 from both sides. P over 2 equals T over 2, so P equals T, right?
Exactly. Nicely done. How about if both firms had a positive cost? Maury, what would be the equilibrium then? Do you remember what the pass-through is under linear demand?
It would be a half, right?
Okay, right? So this is just going to be equal to this whole thing plus what?
Plus like the cost.
Divided by 2.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's just going to add on like P, like C is going to do.
Yeah.
And like T did. And so what would the equilibrium here be?
It would just be T plus C.
Exactly. Okay. So overall there's a pass-through of 1, and the reason is that no consumers would exit the market. And as a result of that, like, an increase in cost just gets passed 1 for 1 into price because there's no like exiting of consumers out of the market. Okay. Now, this is just one example, but in general you could solve this using reaction functions. And the same basic principles that apply to monopoly are going to apply more generally to this differentiated products Nash and prices model. So Rishi, what's going to be the elasticity of your demand holding fixed the prices of all other firms? This is sort of the elasticity of the demand facing this monopolist, right? Because he's taking all the other prices as given, and then he's going to charge along this sort of residual demand curve, which holds fixed the prices of all the other firms.
Would you take the elasticity generally would be the quantity of the derivative of the quantity?
Yeah, with respect to the price, right? And then what do you do to turn it into an elasticity?
Multiply by the percentage.
You multiply it by the price and divide it by the quantity, right?
Right, yeah.
And then, but if I want to hold fixed all the other firms' prices, then what type of derivative do I take?
What do you mean?
Okay, when I take the derivative of one thing holding fixed other things, have you taken multivariate yet?
Not.
Okay. So there's like the notion of a partial derivative,
Yeah, so,
right? Which is the partial derivative of quantity with respect to price. And then we take a negative and you multiply that by price divided by quantity, right? That's the residual, the partial elasticity in some sense, right? And then firms are just going to price according to the Lerner rule that the relative markup is equal to the inverse of the residual elasticity now. Now, of course, there's nothing specific to this about prices being strategies. We could also define the residual elasticity holding fixed other firms' quantities or anything else, right? You just have to hold fixed something for the other firm. We could also hold fixed the other firm's prices and derive my optimal quantity using the inverse demand holding fixed everybody's prices, right? But this basic model where we hold fixed other firms' prices is used extremely broadly in industrial economics, and we'll use this to talk about lots of things in competition policy during the next lecture. Now, oligopolists create externalities for each other. And how do they do that, Joan? What are the types of externalities that oligopolists create on each other?
They can either benefit each other by kind of strategizing so that maybe the leader manages to be in a position where they can all have increased much or decreased demand or a higher.
Sure, but I'm just saying, forgetting about any strategies they do together, what are the externalities that one oligopolist creates on the other by changing their strategy?
It basically affects the ability for other firms to price.
Yeah, and how does it do that?
By changing prices.
Yeah, by changing the prices or the quantities, right? So firms, when they change their strategies, affect other firms, the terms that other firms get in the markets, either the quantities that they have or the prices that they're getting. Now those externalities under Cournot are purely pecuniary. And Rishi, why is that the case?
Well, because any reduction in price or reduction in quantity would is reflected in another firm's production, right? So.
Well, what's the definition of a pecuniary externality?
Well, any the effects between things are reflected in the price system.
It's purely driven through prices, right? And in the Cournot model, what adjusts when I change my quantity and what do I hold fixed?
When you adjust your quantity, price adjusts in addition. And what you're holding fixed is the what everybody else's quantities are.
Exactly. So all effects that I have on other firms come through prices in the Cournot model. That's right. And therefore, all externalities are purely pecuniary, right? On the other hand, under differentiated products, Nash and prices, all your externalities are purely real. And Mike Fosco, why is that the case?
Because you take as given the prices of given, so then they have to change quantities.
Exactly, and changes driven through quantities are real changes, right? So this implies that quantities are always going to be too low under Cournot. Why is that? Because when the firm increases its quantities, it has purely pecuniary externalities on all the firms, and it is a direct positive externality from increasing its quantity on the consumers, and that means it's going to choose too low of a quantity, right? But Dake, do firms under Bertrand necessarily charge to have too low of a quantity?
Sorry.
You have no idea. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else want to try taking that on? Yeah, Mike.
Would prices be higher?
Okay. So we said that quantity is always too low under Cournot. Does quantity need to be too low under Bertrand for all firms?
Oh, sorry. No, because you've made assumptions about other firms' quantities that would make you. I'm actually not sure. I thought the
Is
question
this
was
aggregate quantities or quantities for each individual firm?
This is for one individual firm.
Oh.
What do you think, Evan?
So we actually talked about how this can actually result in firms with high marginal costs actually producing, which is not what we would want. That's too high.
Yeah.
So you can have situations where it's too high.
Well, in particularly low quality firms. So imagine that there are two firms. One firm produces a high quality product that has a really big markup. Another firm produces a low quality product that has a really low markup. Now, and imagine these are substitutes for one another. You can either buy the high quality product for a high price or the low quality product for a low price. Actually, it could be beneficial if the low quality product were to raise its price, because that would drive more people to buy the high quality product. That might actually be socially beneficial. Because it might be that people are buying the cheap product because the markup is so high on the high quality product, right? So actually under Nash and prices, you could have too high quantities for some firms because of the real externality they have by stealing business from the higher quality firm. Okay. Regardless of the social benefits and costs, firms can benefit from internalizing these types of externalities because goods are substitutes. One firm's lowering its quantity or raising its price will benefit its competitor. And in fact, this is how we define firms being substitutes, right? And when firms act to internalize these externalities across firms, what do we say that they're doing? Julian?
They're merging? Yes.
Yeah, or when they're not doing it legally, what would you call it?
Colluding.
Exactly. Or forming a cartel. Right. And my favorite phrase for this is a very old-fashioned one, combinations in the restraint of trade. And these have been denounced by economists ever since Adam Smith. So Adam Smith said that people who are in the same industry as one another rarely meet on friendly terms unless it's in a conspiracy against the public interest. And this was made illegal under the Sherman Antitrust Act. So the reason that the Sherman Antitrust Act got passed was because people were really concerned about the power of these combinations in the restraint of trade. And muckraking journalists during the Progressive era made a lot of hay about this. And particularly they created cartoons like this showing the power that these combined firms would had. And in fact, that's why I have that octopus in my office that maybe some of you guys have seen during office hours, is to represent this picture that I often show students. This was of Standard Oil, which, as you know, had an important role in the founding of this university. So once upon a time, cartel agreements were legally enforceable. In fact, that was true in the United States prior to the Sherman Act, and in continental Europe prior to the EU reforms. And it's hardly even illegal in many developing countries like Peru. In Britain, it was banned all the way back to the 18th century. And in the United States, nowadays, the U.S. government is probably the leading antitrust, anti-cartel enforcer in the world. Explicit agreements between firms about prices or services are now illegal. Yeah, Evan?
Why are sports cartels then something that we see in the United States?
What's a sports cartel?
Like the NFL or the NBA.
NCAA.
They have exemptions from the antitrust laws.
Why?
Good question. I don't know. I mean, the idea is that there's...
Do you really want the USFL to come back?
I don't even know if sports are socially valuable.
Well, I mean, the idea is that there's something that you need to do to manage competition so that firm, like, because what makes it fun is that it's competitive. And so that's, I think, the idea behind the antitrust exemption. Yeah, Tanner?
Well, I mean, it goes back to the 1920s, the Supreme Court in baseball made
Yeah.
it to, because the players wanted higher salaries, so they were going to form their own league.
Yeah.
And they sued for antitrust. And back then, this was very pro-business, anti-workers.
Yeah.
So they were okay with the owners. And baseball still has that antitrust exception.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think that the reason why this is maintained is that people are afraid that if you just allow people to completely freely compete, that someone like the Yankees would like end up with all the money, and then it would no longer be fun to watch professional sports.
Isn't that what happens in Europe?
Yes, it's completely free.
Ridiculous.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I'm not sure that whether this is a good or a bad policy, but it is the policy. Okay, so it can be illegal if you don't make an explicit agreement. If you think that the firms are somehow taking into account the good of the other firm implicitly or tacitly, but this is much harder to prove and therefore much less enforced against. And there are both criminal penalties, such as jail time, and civil penalties for collusion. And in particular, the civil penalties, because it's not easy to catch this sort of thing, are usually 3 times the damages to consumers, because it's assumed, and this is completely arbitrary, but it's assumed that you only catch about 1 in every 3 cartels. Yeah.
Someone mentioned the USFL earlier. The famous story of that is they won the antitrust case, but the damages were $1. So they were trebled to $3.
I see.
And they gave Donald
That's funny. I didn't know about that.
Which I think he still has.
He founded the USFL?
At that time,
This is U.S. Football League?
He was in control of it. He had bought one of the teams and was like the one.
This is was a competitor to the NFL that completely failed? I see. I didn't know about
They
that.
played football in the spring and beginning of the summer. It was like
Weird.
Americans needed more football.
I see. Yeah, I see.
Have there? I know you had one old paper that suggested that you from what was his name in the readings.
Stigler?
Stigler.
Yeah. We're about to talk through all that.
Yeah, that estimated the probability of detection. Has there been recent stuff, or is that what you're going to talk about?
No, I'm not going to talk about any of the empirical work on this stuff, but yeah. Okay, so I don't actually know what the most recent estimates of the probability of detections are. I haven't followed that literature that much. Okay, so there's many practical challenges as a result of it being illegal to running a cartel these days. Collusion is often difficult and therefore only possible in very limited settings. And the basic problem is that a cartel benefits all of its members, but each firm is going to have an incentive to portray that cartel. Bharat, why is that the case?
Because it could be like a prisoner's dilemma sort of thing, where you could lower the price and benefit. So it's in your interest to do that, even if it's against interest.
In fact, that's exactly what an externality means, right? An externality means that unless something's forcing me to do it, I'm not going to take that thing into account, right? And each firm will benefit by decreasing their price or increasing their quantity, which would hurt other firms, but would benefit them by taking business away from their rivals, right? And in fact, the more ambitious a cartel is, the less stable it's going to be. The harder it is going to be to maintain that cartel. Rishi, why is that true?
Well, yeah, if each person in the cartel is more ambitious.
By ambitious, I mean it's like they're earning more profits, right? If it tries to elevate things higher above what you would get in an oligopolistic outcome.
One firm can undercut by like a significantly less margin. And so you can steal the profits, but without having to undercut like an enormous amount of yourself. It's better.
Yeah, in particular, when there's a lot of profits on the table, you have more incentive to steal a lot of them, right? Okay, whereas near the competitive level, you hardly gain any profits by undercutting. So the extent of collusion, therefore, is sort of determined by the ability to deter cheating. And as a result, every cartel, if it wants to actually achieve much in terms of collusion, needs to create expectations by other cartel members that they will punish deviations, right? And policy, on the other hand, tries to make this difficult, right? So the goal of the cartel is to ensure that there exists these credible punishments of cheaters, whereas the goal of the agency is to catch the cartel and prevent them from creating an expectation of credible punishments. And Stigler's theory is basically about this multi-level cat and mouse game where the cartel is trying to catch cheaters and the government is trying to catch the cartel and stop them from catching their cheaters so that the cartel will fall apart. Yeah, Philip.
Do you know exactly what punishment mechanism OPEC uses?
Yeah, so I think OPEC punishes cheaters by flooding the market with oil. The members agree that if one person defects, that all other members will flood the market with oil. And that's actually happened at some points during OPEC's operation when one member was misbehaving. For example, when Iran during the 1980s tried to produce more oil because they were in war with Iraq, all the other members flooded the market with oil and made it very hard for Iran to earn any revenue as a result. Christian.
I know that I guess that's happened, but like, is that still a credible threat? Like, I don't know. It seems difficult for me to imagine all the other countries just wanting to flood the markets. It seems like it would hurt them a lot too.
Yeah, I mean, they might not have to do it for that long if it hurt Iran for a while. I mean, that's the idea. Is like you do that for a while and then you go back to the other equilibrium.
Okay.
Yeah. Or another thing that you can do that's more efficient is you can say, we're going to flood the market with oil unless you start agreeing to a new agreement where you make up for your past misbehavior by having a lower market share. So that's a more efficient way of doing it. Yeah, Tanner.
Since obviously OPEC is some business even with our cartel and most governments have cracked down on cartels, are there any mechanisms nowadays for dealing with?
The fundamental problem is there's no international antitrust authorities. And this is a huge problem. So like in the US, like OPEC is one case of this. But if you're a little country like Peru, and there's like companies serving all of Latin America, and they merge, like what country goes after them? It's a big problem, right? So for the US, it's less of a problem because we're such a big market that we have like power to like stop these sorts of things. But as small countries don't. And for them, international antitrust enforcement is really important and doesn't exist. So, okay, in order to deter cheating, what does a cartel need to do, Christian?
I mean, I would say you have to have the credible punishment, right?
Yeah, what else do you need to do?
So you need to be able to detect if someone is cheating.
Exactly.
And you need to be able to enforce that punishment, but outside the law.
Exactly. So you need to be able to, first of all, you have to even determine what the optimal agreement is, right? Which is a problem because as we know from externalities, there's usually diffuse information about what the right level of something is to do, right? And it's further, that sort of communication that's necessary to achieve that is further hindered. It was already really problematic, even if you could do it legally. And if you can't do it legally, then it gets really hard, right? You have to have a clear sense of what does and does not constitute cheating, because, and this is a real problem, because you want to give firms some flexibility. I mean, if they suddenly get an opportunity to make a bunch of profits because there's, some great sales opportunity that's only available to them, or they get a reduction in cost all of a sudden, you want them to be able to expand their quantity, but if you allow them to freely do that, then it gives them a free ride to cheat. So that's a problem, right? You have to be able to detect cheating from background noise, right? Because there are many things where the firm didn't do anything at all, but they just, through no fault of their own, ended up getting more profits, and you don't want to punish that because then you'll get into a price war over nothing, right? You have to have a cost-effective means of punishment. So as we were talking about, if it's not going to be credible, if it's going to hurt everybody, right? So these like market share type things are going to be better because they're going to be closer to like taxing one firm and redistributing to the other. Because as we talked about when we talked about crime, you want to deter things at the lowest cost possible, right? And you have to be able to do this quickly, because otherwise the firms are going to say, hey, they're not going to punish me anytime soon, might as well just cheat and make a lot of profits in the interim, and maybe they'll eventually get around to punishing me, but who cares at that point, right? So Stigler's theory was based on factors that help the firms achieve or limit their ability to achieve these things. So Andrew, what were some of the factors that Stigler highlighted?
So the large heterogeneous buyers,
matters make it easier to, or harder to track. Then, like growing demand versus declining demand.
Mhm.
So if you have declining demand, then you're more willing to go and get what you can while you can, as opposed to
Yeah, and that makes it harder to sustain collusion, right? Yeah, so he emphasized that if you had, as Andrew said, if you had large or heterogeneous buyers, then it's going to be really hard to like parcel up the market. So for example, in Peru, the government was accused of facilitating collusion in an auction by dividing the country up into 3 segments when there were 3 producers of the product. So each could take one. Whereas if you had only one thing that you were bidding for, then the companies would find it really hard to collude because one would be the winner and the others would have to be losers, right? Also, large buyers can possibly try to break up the cartel if they realize it's going on, try to play the guys against each other. Whereas if there's small homogeneous buyers, they're going to have a really hard time coordinating themselves to fight back against the cartel, and it'll be really easy to chop things up finely to fit all the things. Heterogeneity of the products and the firms makes it harder to collude because there's all these different guys are going to have different information about exactly what they're producing, and it's going to be hard to come up with like an equitable agreement that everyone is on board with without a lot of communication. Price transparency. If it's clear what prices firms are charging, it'll be easier for them to collude, right? But if prices are opaque, it will be harder for them to collude because it will be harder to know when one firm has defected. They might offer, say, secret discounts to one of their customers, and the other firms might not be able to figure that out. In industry, and by the way, this is one reason why the antitrust authorities are often concerned about industry associations that like collect data about the industry because it might make it easier to collude. Industry concentration helps reduce the tracking problem because there aren't as many people to keep track of, and one firm won't have a temptation to like break out from being this little firm and grab the whole market because they'll all have a stake in the market doing well. The more demand fluctuates around, the harder it's going to be to figure out what's cheating and what's just natural fluctuations. The frequency of interaction makes it easier for firms to detect things sooner. So like the more, like if we're in bidding, the more often we have bids, the easier it is going to be to keep track of things, or if sales figures come out frequently. Whereas if we only learn about things with a long delay, then firms will have an incentive to undercut the collusive agreement, and while they can, and won't be too worried about punishment by other firms. Growing demand helps, as Andrew said, and declining demand hurts. Because if demand is declining, you want to grab everything you can now, which will break collusion, rather than worrying about the fact that you might get punished in the future. Okay, so all of these factors determine the extent to which firms are going to be able to deter their members from cartels, will be able to deter their members from colluding. And most of that deterrence happens through some form of a price war, right? Where, as I said, you might flood the market or otherwise, really reduce prices in order to try to hurt the other firms. So one simple way to summarize this is firms' conjectures about if they take some action, how the other firms will respond, right? Exactly what firms' conjectures will be, of course, depends on Stigler's factors. If I expand my quantity, do I think the other firms will punish me by expanding their quantities? Or, be nice and actually reduce their quantities, in which case that's going to encourage me to be more aggressive, right? So this is a model that incorporates this explicitly is called a conjectural variations model. And these usually use some parameter of how much I conjecture other firms will change their price when I change mine, to try to capture the extent to which firms anticipate being punished, right? And the conjectural variations is sort of a broad framework that incorporates all of the theories, because you can nest Bertrand, Cournot, and all these forms of collusion into just different conjectures about what the other firms will do. Okay, so the we've now seen a bunch of different sources of firms' market power. In Cournot, market power comes out of having few firms. When there are differentiated products, it comes out of the fact that prices will be above cost to the extent that people have this transportation cost, that they view the other products as different, right? We saw that as transportation costs went up, firms' prices went up. Also, if we have search frictions, it can also happen if firms have heterogeneous costs. All of these things can be sources of market power. And market power can be particularly severe if there are complementarities between monopolized products, as we'll talk about in lecture 16. But for welfare and incidence, it's going to be the level rather than the particular source of market power that is going to be important. And a way to summarize the degree of market power is the degree to which pecuniary versus real effects are internalized. So let's consider this in the case of symmetric firms. We won't get to talk about asymmetric firms, but the analysis is pretty similar. When a firm changes any strategy that it has, this has basically two effects on profits in the industry. One that's basically, they correspond to two different types of sort of externalities or effects that we generally talk about. Philip, what are those two effects?
If it assumes that the other firms are going to just fix a quantity, if it lowers a price, then it's going to create a pecuniary externality by transferring from the firm to the consumer.
Yeah.
And by raising a quantity and taking market share, that's a real externality on the other firm because it's taking profitable units away from it.
Yeah, so we can actually just like put all those things together into a set of real effects that the firm has and a set of pecuniary effects, right? The real effects that it has are the changes in its quantities times the markup. So the changes in any industry quantities multiplied by the markup, right? Those aren't mediated through prices, so they're real effects. On the other hand, it can have pecuniary effects of changing prices, and then that'll be multiplied by the quantities, right? So the two effects that you can have on the industry are changing quantities multiplied by markups and changing prices multiplied by quantities. And I'm out of time, so I'm going to come back and finish this up at the start of the next lecture.